What do you think are the characteristics, for me as an early stage investor or for angels out there listening, if you had to go invest in the next unicorn, given that you've seen so many and worked at so many, what are you kind of looking for?
Yeah, so now, of course, Brian, if we knew for sure which company would turn into a unicorn when they're at the early stage, then we would have solved all the world's problems, right? So there's never any certainty. However, there are some, as you say, indicators, right? So I think one of the key indicators is that the founders have made the transition of just building a product to building a go-to-market machine, right? And that is something many founders have a lot of trouble with. But some of the best unicorns I worked with, they were adamant about.
Hey everyone, welcome back to the Ignite podcast. Today we're delighted to have my former colleague, Roland Siebelink, on the program. He's the founder and CEO at MidStage Institute, where he helps tech founders transition from, call it a 0 to 1 startup to a scale up. Roland, welcome to the program.
Well, thank you, Brian. So happy that you were able to find the time. This has been an honor to get invited.
Yeah, I've been really looking forward to this conversation. Would love to get an intro from you for the audience.
Yeah, so I've been very lucky to be in 3 unicorns in succession, every time growing the company from about 10 to about 1,000 employees in 3 years' time. And, I started to see similar patterns in all those different companies, different use cases, different countries. Nevertheless, same patterns coming back and back. And so I now actually help founders that are going through that journey the first time and get them on the right path to become a unicorn. So it typically means starting with them once they've got some degree of product market fit, and then helping them make the startup more robust while still keeping that energy and zeal alive, and trying as hard as possible not to turn it into a boring corporation.
I love that. So what kind of ARR and kind of growth rates do you like to sort of kind of come in? Where do you see, the wheels starting to fall off on the scale up, and where does it make sense to
Yeah,
research?
I think that's actually a really good definition. Like, where's the wheel falling off? Because the problem is that many people stick with the habits they acquired in the early stage startup and do not then, change those for what is needed in the mid stage, right? And I think that really feels like the wheel coming off. And typically that is driven more by team size than purely by ARR. Of course, there's a correlation there. But the team size that we typically start really helping is from about 25 to 30 people, which is kind of like that tipping point when you can no longer have everyone around the breakfast table. You need a bit of level differentiation. And so you're starting to have managers, right? And indirect instructions. And that basically means that as the spider in the web, the CEO in the center, you can no longer control everything directly. And that's very hard when exactly what has made you successful in the beginning as a founder is to control the experience very directly. I mean, I'm no advocate for micromanagement, but let's face it, Brian, if you're an early stage founder, you kind of have to be a micromanager to get this thing up and running.
Yeah, I mean, there's a phrase in VC that the founders that are hardest to work with are the best ones, because
Yes.
they're so controlling about every aspect. It's like a really great restaurant owner. If you've ever known a really great restaurateur, they're maniacal with the detail of
That's
everything in
exactly
their
the word
restaurant.
I'm looking for, maniacal, exactly. And, we both have friends with small kids as well. So when they cannot sleep because the kids are crying all night or are never happy, I'm like, oh, they're probably going to be great founders later in life.
So let's talk about a little bit about your background, how you got from, call it, growing up, college to, your first unicorn.
Yeah. Well, I grew up in the Netherlands, where that's where my funny accent comes from. And then I went to college in Belgium, Brussels. So really capital of Europe, very international city, loved it. And also, I studied communication, which at the time was kind of in a flux from focusing on mass media to focusing on all kinds of new media. And I'm going to date myself here because in those days, new media were things like the internet but nobody had ever heard of, right? So I actually was the first researcher in continental Europe to be able to focus on this newfangled internet from a social science perspective. So talk about the human aspects and how this would be integrated in society, things like that. And that really turned into press coverage, into like co-founding the first internet startup back in Belgium, and ultimately in launching the first broadband internet network in Europe Europe from 1996 onwards. Very fun times where nobody over 30 would trust themselves or be trusted with something as new. So at 27, I was running a department of 45 with my colleague of 29 running a department of 30 next to that. And so basically we were running a business unit all by ourselves. It was so much fun.
Yeah, that's amazing. And then what was that transition like from Europe to the US? What prompted that?
Oh, that came a lot later, actually. First transition afterwards was that I went to business school in Switzerland and I joined a tech company in Switzerland. And that was actually also a unicorn, but then one that went through bad times as well, because this was around the dot-com bust. And so this was a company we had to pull back from having announced an IPO, being ready for everything, and at the very last minute saying, we cannot do it. This is not going to work. And so that also meant making a lot of changes in the strategy, which really had focused on making investors and possible investors completely happy with all the hype. Imagine, Brian, this was a company with just 350 staff that was running 500 projects, all publicly announced. So, you can imagine how sustainable that was. And as soon as they decided not to do the IPO and leave the hype cycle, in a sense, that meant a lot of cleaning up and rationalization and actually focusing on the things that generated usage, if not revenue.
Wow, so you went through at least 2 unicorns that fell from grace because we were together at Rocket Fuel, back in 2014, 15, 16, and it was high flying when I joined. Just had doubled revenue. I was in a class of 100 employees, and went through an IPO, and then the agencies discovered that we had really high margins, and they didn't like that.
Yeah, Rocket Fuel definitely was a cautionary tale, let's say. But then again, many companies that reach that unicorn status and then get to IPO status, often they are in a rush to do so. Internal RSUs or stock options may be running out. Early investors want some liquidity. And so very often you see them going public when they're in a way maybe not quite ready for it yet, or when, like in the company I mentioned before, when there are tons and tons of hype projects going about that really do not serve the long-term sustainability of the business. So I think, of course, we all need to get some hype up and running, and we need to focus on future opportunities. But actually finding that balance between what's the irrational exuberance of the future versus what's the sustainable business that we can actually keep building today. That's part of what we do as we work with companies a little bit longer and start delving into their strategy.
And then let's before we get to more lessons from Rocket Fuel, because that's a fascinating story, and I've had a few folks on here, including Richard Frankel, co-founder.
Richard.
Yeah, I don't know if he listens to the podcast, but he was like guest number 8 or 9.
Yeah,
and then of course Randy Wooten was on the podcast too. He was guest maybe in the 30-ish. So we talked a lot about Rocket Fuel and what we learned. But what was the second unicorn?
Second unicorn, that was the Swiss company. It was called Blue Win. And so I stayed there for about 4 years until it was more rationalized. And then the reason why I came to America was that I joined a local startup called Topic Marks. And they had built a very early version of artificial intelligence, generative AI. At the time, that was called semantic networks. And basically, I said, this is so amazing. We have to go find funding for it in Silicon Valley. And off I went.
You've been at quite a few unicorns, and you've probably helped some along the way after the 3 that you directly worked at. What do you think are the characteristics? For me as an early stage investor, or for angels out there listening, if you had to go invest in the next unicorn, given that you've seen so many and worked at so many, what are you kind of looking for?
Yeah, so now, of course, Brian, if we knew for sure which company would turn into a unicorn when they're at the early stage, then we would have solved all the world's problems, right? So there's never any certainty. However, there are some, as you say, indicators, right? So I think one of the key indicators is that the founders have made the transition of just building a product to building a go-to-market machine. Right. And that is something many founders have a lot of trouble with. But some of the best unicorns I worked with, they were adamant about setting high sales targets for themselves, making it happen, setting high pipeline targets, keeping the pressure on. And what I loved about that unicorn in particular was that they really always benchmarked themselves against the top quartile startups out there. And they said, do we really want to, I know it's hard, but do we really just want to have the ambition to be one of the many, or do we want to be top quartile? And that every
Mm.
time again, pulled them forward, made them reach their sales targets. And, that's how they reached unicorn territory. And I think, of course, they did product development as well. And they worked on, hiring and all the other stuff. But I think that prime focus on hitting the sales numbers and especially getting this in a replicated manner that is systematic, that is, I think, what really differentiates the true future unicorns from the rest.
Yeah, I love that. And then let's go back to some of the lessons. So you were at one unicorn, the first one that kind of failed to IPO,
That was the second
internet.com.
that failed to IPO. The first
Oh,
one did
okay.
IPO. So, but yes,
Yeah.
all of them, of course, have both the accolades and some of the hairy stories around it.
Yeah. Are there any commonalities between the two or three that kind of had a decline after reaching, a billion or multi-billion-dollar valuation?
I think the decline is almost expected, right? So I think after a company goes public, one main driver typically is that early investors do want out, and often they see a value that they can pitch to the market that may not necessarily be sustainable. So, I think experienced investors know that it's usually only interesting to invest in IPOs when you're part of the investment bank's inner circle, let's say, right? But if otherwise you want to be part of early stage startups or later stage startups, I should say in this case, it's better to get in before the IPO because that's usually not the best time to get maximum value out of it. I would say the on the strong sides, the having a very clear business model, having like a flywheel that can keep turning again and again, and being quite focused on that flywheel, those were always factors that helped these
Mm.
companies sustain at least that part of the revenue. On the bad side, I think the more projects and speculation they had and new business lines that they were trying to spin up, especially if they hadn't reached full potential in their core markets yet. Those are, I think, typically detractors from both revenue growth and sustainability.
Yeah. So let's talk about the transition. I mean, after Rocket Fuel, what were you doing and what was kind of the founding of MidStage?
Yeah. So Rocket Fuel became big enough to have too many complex decisions all going through a single management team. I think you'll recall those days. And so I think they made a very wise decision at some point in time to say, let's set up some business units so that we have three areas, each run by very competent leaders, but that can each focus on their one core market, core customer, core benefits for that market, right? And so in a way that meant a simplification for those teams, even if of course it meant a delegation for the most senior management team. And because this was a big, confidence measure as well, like, do we actually trust everyone to run this? They said, can we give them some guidance? Can we do some coaching? And they asked me to coach all those business units. As a result, I got myself certified in this methodology, Scaling Up, which has been helping over 4,000, maybe 5,000 startups around the world now, and got a specialist in that, and basically got my first experience coaching those companies in those business units in the Rocket Fuel days. And then having worked with all those people, one thing led to another, and people started asking me can you do that for my company outside of Rocket Fuel too? And at that time, it kind of felt like it was the time to move on and start doing this full time to help even more companies.
So interesting. So you transitioned when you left Rocket Fuel, you transitioned right into MidStage because
I
you had
did
this
because
customer demand to help.
exactly. And, many people who go independent will say the hardest is to get your first customer,
Mm-hmm.
often takes about a year or so. In my case, I did my first workshop literally the first day after I left Rocket Fuel, December
That's
1st,
amazing.
2016. I still remember very clearly.
That's amazing. And then let's talk a little bit about the scale up methodology. What did you
Yeah.
learn in that program? Do you obviously you probably recommend it, but tell us about it. I'm not familiar with it, and probably some of the audience isn't either.
Yeah, it's actually a great methodology that's been applied and refined for almost 25 years now. Vern Harnish, the founder, started that while he was still a student in at the East Coast there, and basically he's been refining that with entrepreneurial organization and other organizations for a long time. It's not particularly focused on tech startups, but I'll get back to that. This is really for growth companies in all industries. And what they focus on is really, once you've got the basics of each function figured out, like, okay, you've got a head of sales, you've got a head of marketing, you've got a head of product, head of finance, and each of these functions are roughly running okay, can always optimize, but then really the value starts to be created not by each individual function, but by these functions working together, right? How do they start thinking like a cross-functional process? How do they deliver value end to end? And also consistent decisions around what actually is our focus strategy? How do we manage our people? How do we ensure that all of our priorities get executed by the end of the month? And how do we manage our cash and our runway, right? And so it's these cross-functional decisions that really start driving the overall valuation of the company. And that's what we help with a lot. The concrete tool we help companies develop is the one-page strategic plan, which is literally a one-pager that has all the key high-level decisions in one place, so that everyone knows within, what are the lines within which they can color, essentially, right? And this is a giant and lever for more delegation inside the company, so that people actually know, as long as I follow these goals or this mission or these values, then I know I can just move ahead and I don't have to keep asking permission all the time.
Right. And is that doc full of like cascading like OKRs, or like what are the kind of deliverables on that doc?
In the doc, there are the OKRs for the company level. Typically, we try not to have the cascading things in there, but there's many people who develop the systems behind that for levels below. But really what is often missing is that people only see the goals for their own department and then extremely high level goals for the company. We help to make those company goals very concrete and actually put those in priority above the functional goals, right? So it's always company accomplishments are more important than the functional accomplishments, so that the functions actually work together and don't turn into silos. And so, yes, every quarter there are new quarterly OKRs, then there's the annual OKRs, there's sometimes 3-year OKRs as well, so that this all breaks down from what is the vision of the founders into like, what are we actually need to do today in each function to get us one step further forward.
Yeah, and this is really the problem when you get to 25, 50 employees, because you don't have BUs necessarily yet. It's not like rocket fuel, thousands of employee scale, where you have to start kind of dividing the businesses up and having GMs or whatever and their own functional teams underneath that BU.
On that particular note, Brian, if I may interrupt you, I see too many companies trying to resolve just some people conflicts at very low scale with like, oh, let's set up more complex structures. Like there's one company we've worked with in the past that is only 50 employees that want to run 3 business units. And I'm like, okay, that's really not apt for that phase. And so that's really the other thing we teach companies, yes, learn a lot about management advice and the way to run companies better, but always be very careful. Like, does this actually apply to your situation? Right. And I'm sure you've seen tons of early stage founders that say, oh, I should do things this way because Google did it this way or Facebook does it this way. Well, you're not Google or you're not Facebook, at least not yet. So don't take guidance from a 100,000 people company to run your 5 people startup, right?
Right. Yeah, exactly. So what are if you think about the document itself, so along the top, there's OKRs, and how many are there, and how many key results per OKR? Like, are there any guidelines for that startups?
Yeah, absolutely. And I can share a sample that maybe you put in the show notes for people to also look at visually, maybe easier. But running through it from the top of my head, at the very basis is actually what we call the foundation, which is listing the top 3 strengths of the business, the top 3 weaknesses of the business, and then the top 6 trends of the business. Yeah. And really, this is all about getting people aligned on what situation are we in, what do we have to work with, because it's my firm conviction as a facilitator that usually when people disagree, it's not because one is rational and the other is not. It's because they have different sets of facts, right? They have different things to work with in their head. And so it's only when you can... Yeah, it's like, well, different goals, yes, but it starts often from, what is actually the situation that we're in, and everyone's got a different perspective on that.
Do you have a sample ready on your desktop? Because this is a visual podcast, so we could actually...
I can probably pull it up.
You can probably share a screen.
Okay. Cool. So as we can see, for those looking at the screen, at the very bottom, you have the strengths and core competences, weaknesses, and then trends. And the real purpose of this is to have a common foundation so that people all agree what situation are we in, what do we have to work with, and what do we have to respond to, right? Now, in the middle, the bulk of the whole plan is really like, how do we translate our long-term vision and the things we don't really want to change over time, such as core values and purpose, into very concrete goals for this quarter, and then also all the way on the right in what that means for everyone individually, right? How does this translate into your particular responsibility for this quarter? And then at the top, people typically have a list of the KPIs that they want to be tracking on the long run. So you have the financial goals, of course, in there for quarterly and annual, but you also have what we call reputation drivers and productivity drivers. And the thinking there is that it's like a balance between every business needs to both satisfy certain key stakeholder groups, as well as show business performance. This is this balance between reputation and productivity that we have at the top. I will say, Brian, that's typically something we only get to after working with the company for a little bit longer once their long-term metrics start stabilizing.
Right.
But to your point of what are the OKRs and what are the goals, our goal is typically the same as with what Warren Buffett always says. If you have more than 5 goals, number 6 and further are your biggest enemies in getting something done. So we have 5 quarterly rocks, maximum 5, and then if there's something that it doesn't fit, we may have it in the annual initiatives or longer term, or we just say, let's do it next quarter, because we also want to keep that pressure on of like, if you don't finish it this quarter, that doesn't mean you get to automatically continue working on it next quarter.
Mm-hmm. How often does this gets refreshed every quarter?
Yeah, we refresh the right side of this plan every quarter. So that's like the more concrete quarterly and individual side. And then the left side typically gets refreshed once a year, where we revise the strategy and are all our beliefs still correct? Are our strengths and weaknesses still correct? Did we fix something? Has something changed, right? As well as, of course, every quarter we do look at the annual initiatives and say, okay, do they still make sense? And especially in the beginning, people will make a shift or they will move one a little bit. That's all fine. But over time, you start seeing the discipline of like, okay, well, these are the goals we set for this year. We still agreed. Let's break it down further and see what the next step is.
So thinking about timelines, we're an exec team. We just crossed that, Series A mark. We got 25, 30 employees. We're hiring Roland and team to come in. How long does it take to get this page 1 together, this once a year page the first time?
Yeah, first time is typically 1 or 2 day workshop, depending a little bit on the team size. I would say if the executive team is 5 or below, we can typically get it done in 1 day. If it's between 5 and 10, then typically we will need 2 days. But that will be 80% filled out at the end of those 2 days. And sometimes companies, that's all they need, and then they can run with it by themselves, right? Others want more hand-holding, like, okay, now how do we follow up on this on a weekly basis? Can you guys check in with us on a monthly basis to see if we're doing well? Getting that pair of strangers' eyes to force the issue, right? And sometimes it turns into an ongoing arrangement where every quarter we help them draw up the new quarterly priorities and do the annual planning as well with them.
And then what about the quarterly stuff? So the quarterly stuff is a half day every
Yes, for
quarter?
a smaller team, it's half a day. For a team of 5 to 10 people, it's typically a 1 day. So it's not just updating those priorities, because of course you also have to update like the basis on which we make those decisions, right? It's not asking marketing what's your priority, finance what's your priority, and sales what's your priority. It's basically every time I tell them, like, I want you all to think as if you're the CEO, not representing your department here. You should all think like for the company at large, what should be the right 5 priorities if you were in the CEO seat, right? And so to get that discussion going, it's like Eisenhower said, the plan is pretty useless, but the planning is invaluable. It's that discussion that actually is so important. And so updating the understanding, basically doing a proper review of what happened last quarter. What are we happy with? What are we not happy with? Let's actually, dare to voice the concerns that we have and agree on those. That will then help drive very much, one, what deep dives do we need right now to maybe learn something more as a team? Like very often, for example, teams have no clue about sales just don't flow in. You have to build a whole demand generation function to get your pipeline going, and many people have never been exposed to that. So that's one of the typical deep dives that we do. Another one may be, how do we hire better? How do we focus on getting only A players in the company? What is an A player? All those things, right?
Yeah.
And then after those deep dives, then we actually set the priorities for that quarter together with the team. And we make sure that they detail them out enough, a little bit more than what you see on this plan, to be able to run it to their teams immediately and then either hit the ground running in a smaller startup, or if it's a bit larger, they may want another round of feedback with their teams, getting the bottom-up input as well before the quarter truly starts.
And this right side quarterly plan, that's still at the company level. So that's still at the CEO level. It's not at the functional level.
Yes, the actions column that you're looking at, I think that's all at the company level. The theme is also at the company level. It's the only thing that's individual is the your accountability column on the very right. And in this case, you look at the example is the accountability for a VP of HR.
Got it. Okay, so that's how you're rolling down these sort of high-level targets and actions and themes into the individual functional heads.
Yes, absolutely. In this case, you would see that in the company level, there are two key HR responsibilities, right? So implement ENPS and complete top grading training, and that will then come back on the accountability side. But they may also add projects of their own, things that are only departmental rocks, let's call them, that do not rise to the level of the company. They can still do those, but they should always prioritize their time around company priorities first, and only then departmental priorities. And that's also how to coach your people.
Nice. Well, I think we've stared at this for probably long enough, but
yes. Well, thank you for the opportunity to let people stare at it anyway. So
yeah, it's a lot of work. I can see that it would be a lot of people hours to, and you would need somebody like you, like a facilitator that's been there, done that with probably dozens, if not hundreds of teams at this point, to make sure that you guys are staying on task and getting it done.
It's with hundreds of teams right now. And so, having done that and knowing what typically works, what doesn't, helps a lot. There are companies that try to do this in what I call self-service mode, like let's just do this internally, which is of course cheaper. But on the other hand, typically the role of the leader becomes very confusing. Is the leader now a facilitator or the one that pushes through their vision? Or what happens if somebody disagrees? Can you actually let that be voiced in a safe space? And those things all make it very difficult. I found that typically we have to ask a CEO before we do a first workshop with them, like, can you try and sit back a little bit and be the last one to speak in every discussion? This is very unnatural for founders. I'm sure you would agree.
Oh, yeah.
And so they usually will agree, find it very hard to do so. And then I would say by hour 3 of the first morning, you will see them visibly starting to relax. And I'll check in with them during a break, and they'll say, you know what, I was very worried, but I'm actually very relaxed to see that all the ideas that I have in my head, other people are coming up with as well. I can actually trust my team to come up with the right suggestions, even if it may take them a few minutes to get there, right? And then they also start saying, but you know what? I thought Natalie was one of my greatest people, and I'm actually a little bit concerned about her now. Whereas John, I thought was a C player that I needed to get rid of, and I've been so impressed with his contributions. Do you know what's happening there, Brian?
What is it?
So typically, by them staying silent for a while and being the last one to speak, they start seeing who actually has contributions of their own to make versus who is really good at always agreeing with the founder and CEO. And so Natalie, who was in that latter bucket, now has nothing, right? She cannot agree with anything the CEO says because CEO hasn't said anything yet. Whereas John is probably a bit of a contrarian, but is actually making really good suggestions. and now can voice those without having to start from, but actually, I don't agree with you.
Right. Yeah, and most founders haven't, built high performance teams before.
No,
A
they
lot
have
of
not.
Founders. I mean, there's some, 1 out of 5, 1 out of 4, something like
Hmm.
that have been execs or VPs at bigger companies or scaling startups. But many founders are product managers, engineer types,
Hmm.
especially in B2B SaaS software where I invest. And so a lot of them, they need a coach to figure out how to build a high performance culture and team. Just never done that. And I think back, everyone, the old adage that everyone needs a coach, right? Even Steph
Hmm.
Curry, greatest shooter of all time, has a shooting coach. Tiger Woods
Absolutely.
has a golf coach, right? So even the highest performing athletes in the world that are paid, hundreds of millions of dollars to play their sport have coaches. And so why not you as a CEO, as a founder of a company? Why not get a coach and learn from that coach that's helped dozens, if not hundreds, of CEOs and founders just like you build great companies?
Yeah, I love how you voiced that. I couldn't have said it better myself. And I think we all agree that being a founder is a very, very difficult, challenging job. It costs a lot of energy, a lot of skill set. And so if it is such a demanding job, then indeed having a coach makes a lot of sense. The other thing I would add there is the word coach is of course used very broadly in the business world in particular. And I think it's also a matter of like, what kind of coach do you really need? I think many people look for an executive coach in general, and then they find the kind of person who, works with them individually, essentially puts them on a couch and says, talk to me about your problems, which has a lot of value. I mean, I'm not disparaging it, but it also feels a little bit like, having an individual trainer for an athlete when they're on a team sport, right?
Mm,
That kind of is a little bit weird. So I think it is quite important to find a coach that helps you actually operate well within your team and with your team, and that it's ultimately the company they work for and not just for the individual, right?
exactly. So where do founders normally kind of trip up when they don't engage a coach in this kind of 25 to 50 employee kind of realm?
I think they trip up by staying, in control of everything for too much, not letting people come up with their own ideas or particularly their own ways of doing things. So I call it like a yes and amen culture, right? So where the founder says, okay, we should do this, and everyone jumps. And then as soon as they've jumped once, they'll forget about it because they know the founder will forget about it too. And then the next day there's something else, right? And I think we see this at
Mm.
tons and tons of early stage startups. It's almost like
Management by shiny objects.
management by shiny objects or the hey squirrel syndrome or
So
whatever,
yeah.
right? Two ways to deal with that, or maybe you need both. One is to realize that often this is driven by founders being very dependent, if not addicted to a little bit of a dopamine kick, right? So they like to focus on the
Mm,
things that keep them, that they find interesting, that they find exciting or cool. And as soon as it's not cool or exciting, it gets into drudgery or grit or whatever, then they're like, well, that should be for somebody else. But if they're the ones taking all the decisions, then the whole company forgets about that discipline, right?
right. Right.
And I've seen that time and time again. If you asked me before, like what really shows off a future unicorn versus other companies, it's that embracing of the grit and the discipline rather than just focusing on what's cool, right?
Yeah.
And the other thing really is learning that if the goal is met even in a different way than you would have done it, that's still better for the company. And how to basically start learning to let people do their own thing. And your job is no longer to do it for them, but to basically look at, are they reaching the results?
Exactly. Yeah, I love that. Can you think of a company that you've worked with and helped scale up that you're particularly proud of? And what was that company and why are you so proud of it?
I will talk about Redox, which is the company providing basically all the plumbing underneath the integrated healthcare
Mm,
records. So essentially, when you have, you're using an app and it pulls up your medical records from your hospital, Redox basically provides that plumbing underneath. And loved working with those guys. They had a very mission driven company from the outset. We're very adamant about helping all these startups get integrated with those systems. And we went through many cycles with them about setting the goals, setting, ever higher revenue targets, of course. Also tough times when, beginning of the pandemic or at the end of the pandemic, then of course economic circumstances were worse and we had to take some action there. We go through everything together.
Yeah, I love that. Why don't we close up with a rapid fire round?
Of course.
What's a book that's profoundly impacted your approach to business?
I would mention a non-business book, which is called The Courage to be Disliked.
I love that.
And,
what were the lessons there? Yeah.
The lesson there is that you cannot really reach your priorities, whether business or personal, when you're constantly focused on, am I being popular? Does everyone like what I'm doing? And so I think, especially in this age of social media and people gathering likes and karma and stuff like that, I think it's important to realize that sometimes you have to find your own way in life. And part of that means not always being liked by everyone.
Yeah, I love that. If you could mentor any tech founder from history, who would it be and why?
Oh, that is a great question. I am tempted to use one of the big names, but I would probably say I would still prefer to work with a tech founder who had a great product and somehow didn't make it and get them back on the right track. So let's say the anonymous founder.
Yeah, the anonymous didn't make it founder. What's one startup myth you'd like to debunk?
That being agile is always the right approach, especially the constant pivoting. I think that is very, very, very good for the early stage. But as you do find some product market fit, now it's time to start exploiting rather than to continue exploring.
Yeah, that makes sense. Describe the most challenging moment in your career in 3 words.
Co-founder conflict. Are those 3 words?
Yeah, kind of. Co-founder conflict. I love that. What was that?
That was at one of my startups where I believe the expectations were very, very divergent, where the co-founder believed that as soon as we would raise a series seed, life would be comfortable and there would be no more pressure. And after that, I think things started to turn really bad. I'll leave it at that.
I mean, I've seen it multiple times in my portfolio when, it's seed A, somewhere in there, one of the co-founders leaves, and it's a really difficult place because there's a divergence of commitment, I think.
Yes,
and,
exactly. And a lot of loss of trust.
Could just go back and make $1 million at Google and just have breakfast, lunch, and dinner served to them. Why am I doing this startup?
Exactly, and it's maybe a rational question to ask, but maybe not at that time.
Yeah. What's your favorite productivity hack?
My favorite productivity hack is defining at the beginning of the day the few things you absolutely want to get done, and then to keep them on a list in front of you until the end of the day, until you're done.
If you had to choose one, would you prioritize strategy or execution?
Very good question. For now, I would say execution. The reason I say that is that most companies are so bad at execution that it doesn't really matter what strategy they have. It's only once they become good at execution, then it starts mattering what strategy they have.
Yeah, that makes sense. All there is execution. You can execute your way out of a lot of things. What's a technology that you believe will have the biggest impact on tech in the next 5 years? And you'll probably say AI, but I'll ask a follow-up. But
I think you're right. Of course, it has to be AI, but AI is also a very big bucket. And I think maybe what is more important to understand is that ultimately it's less the AI per se, and it's more the data underneath that will really have the impact. And I think we already see the market moving towards those who own the data and those who can gather gigantic amounts of data at scale and keep ownership of that will really have the impact.
How has the large language model phenomenon, this whole AI shift, platform shift, impacted your work so far, if at all?
Yeah, definitely. In the beginning, we saw primarily some companies seeing their entire business model change, right? Like where maybe they had humans in the loop, or they had relatively expensive consulting services as part of the business model, where even their clients were just basically starting to replace that with early versions of Gen AI. And so they had to shift really rapidly. At the moment, we're starting to see the first AI companies proper come online as, advisory clients or proper clients. And so we'll definitely see much more entry of those kind of companies into that scaling phase themselves. It's still a little bit early there. Many of them are still in relative early startup mode, even if they've raised a lot of funding. But, as the pressure starts to increase, which I think it will in this year, we'll see more of those companies also needing the discipline and a one-page strategic plan.
What's one piece of advice you'd give your younger self starting out in tech?
Move to America faster.
Why is that? What is that? What is the difference there between the States and Europe?
I think it's actually less a difference between the States and Europe than between just being in Silicon Valley and the rest of the world. And so really, I think if I were to choose again, I'd probably do my business school at Stanford and build my network there. I think it's just that it's the ecosystem here. Everyone knows tech, everyone talks tech. And it's just like if you want to be in banking, then be in London or in Zurich, or
New
if
York.
you want to be exactly New York, of course, or if you want to be in oil, be in Dallas or in Saudi or something like that, right? So this is the local business. So this is where you have to be.
Yeah, that makes sense. I'm technically 2 hours away, but I'm still kind of there. How do you unwind and relax after a long week of work?
Oh, that is a very good question. Well, I'm very fortunate to have two doggies that help me stay grounded and be very relaxed. I'll often take them for a long walk. I'm very fortunate with a husband who's an amazing cook who can often prepare us a very nice home-cooked dinner on Friday night in particular. And, taking a run down the beautiful hills of San Francisco also helps a lot.
Yeah. Last question. What's one key trait you look for in a founder when deciding to work with them?
Stubbornness about their vision combined with extreme pragmatism on how to realize it.
So they're
very,
coachable.
very rare. Very, very rare.
Yeah.
Coachability is part of it, absolutely. Yeah. But it's that they want to really realize the vision and are not giving up on that while at the same time being very pragmatic on how to get there.
I love that. How can listeners connect with you and learn more about MidStage?
Yeah, so we've pulled together a page with some standard resources, including how to get in contact with me. So just go to midstage.org/thrive, and you'll find everything in one place, including our newsletters, podcasts, and all the other stuff that you can look at to be in touch with us or apply our tools in your business yourself.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much, Roland. It was great to catch up. Thanks for coming on the Ignite podcast.
It's been my pleasure, Brian. Thank you for the invitation.